I was 12 the first time I met him, the man in the woods. Of course, back then, I didn't know who he was. But looking back, everything about him screamed wrong. If I'd been smarter, if I'd been more careful, I might have known. But no, I was just a stupid kid with a streak of curiosity a mile wide and a thirst for adventure that led me right into the lion's den. I grew up in a small town, the kind where everyone knows everyone, and secrets are as scarce as snow in July. There wasn't much to do after school except ride bikes, hang out at the old gas station, or explore the woods that bordered the town. My parents always warned me to stay out of them, said it was too easy to get lost, that there were dangerous animals out there. But no one I knew had ever actually seen a bear or a wolf. It was just one of those things that adults say to keep you in line. So, naturally, I spent a lot of time in those woods. It was a grey Saturday morning, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and pine needles. I'd set off on one of my usual explorations, following a thin, winding trail, deeper than I'd gone before. I had no destination in mind, just the thrill of seeing where the path would take me. After about an hour of walking, I noticed the trail starting to twist into unfamiliar shapes. The further I walked, the more I felt like I was stepping into another world. It was then that I saw him. He was standing near a large oak tree, his back to me. He wore a long black coat, the hem brushing the tops of his boots. His hair, jet black, was slicked back against his skull, though it seemed wild in places, like strands were straining to break free. There was something about him that didn't sit right with me, but I couldn't put my finger on it at the time. Maybe it was the way the shadows clung to him, or how he stood too still, like he was waiting for something. I should have turned back, but instead, I called out, "Hey, you lost or something?" He turned slowly, almost too slowly, like he'd been expecting me, but wanted to savour the moment. When his eyes met mine, I froze. They were pitch black, so dark I couldn't see any whites around them. His lips curled into the smallest of smiles. "No," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "I'm exactly where I need to be." I don't know why, but that answer made me shiver. Every sinew in my body was screaming at me to leave, but for some reason, I didn't. Maybe it was the way he looked at me, like he was seeing through me, peeling away my layers. Or maybe it was the strange, electric tension in the air. "What are you doing out here?" I asked, trying to sound braver than I felt. "I could ask you the same," he replied, taking a slow step forward. "But I think we both know you're not just out for a stroll, are you?" I swallowed hard, suddenly feeling exposed. I just like exploring, that's all." "Is that right?" His smile widened, showing teeth that seemed just a little too sharp. "And do you always wander so deep into the woods? Away from where anyone can hear you scream?" I laughed nervously, thinking it was some kind of joke. But the look in his eyes didn't change. It was like he was daring me to test his words. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He cocked his head to the side, considering me for a moment before answering. "I'm someone who's been watching you for a long time." This terrified me. Watching me? Why? "There's something different about you, boy," he said, his voice smooth and oily, like it could slip into the cracks of my mind. "You have potential." "Potential for what?" I asked, my throat tightening. "To do great things," he said, his smile widening further. "Or terrible things. It's all the same in the end." I didn't understand what he meant, not fully, but part of me was intrigued. It was like he was dangling a secret just out of my reach, and if I could only stretch a little further, I'd be able to grasp it. I should go home," I muttered, taking a small step back. I had that sickly feeling in my stomach when you're full of dread. But before I could turn, his voice stopped me. "Wait." There was something in his tone that made it impossible to disobey. I stood, rooted to the spot, my feet refusing to move. "You're not afraid, are you?" he asked, his voice laced with mockery. "You seem brave. I like brave boys." I shook my head. I wasn't brave, not really. But something about his words made me want to prove that I was. "You see," he continued, stepping closer, "I think you and I could have an understanding. I'm looking for someone like you. Someone willing to do a little test for me." "A test?" I repeated, my voice cracking. He nodded. "A simple task. If you succeed, I'll tell you things, show you things, beyond your wildest imagination. Power, knowledge, control. It could all be yours." "What do I have to do?" I asked, despite my stomach feeling like it would drop through the floor. He grinned, his black eyes glittering. "Just follow me." We walked through the woods until we came to a small clearing. In the centre was an old, rotting tree stump. A crow perched on top, staring down at us with cold, beady eyes. He stopped beside the stump and turned to face me. "Here's your first test, boy. I want you to kill the crow." I blinked, not sure I'd heard him right. "Kill it? Why?" "Because I told you to," he said, his voice sharp. "You want to prove yourself, don't you?" I looked at the bird, its dark feathers ruffling slightly in the breeze. It wasn't doing anything, just sitting there, watching me. I didn't want to kill it, but something about the man's gaze made it hard to think straight. Like his will was wrapping around mine, squeezing tighter and tighter. "Do it," he hissed, stepping closer. "Or leave and never come back." I didn't want to seem like a coward. My heart hammered in my chest as I reached down, grabbing a jagged stone from the ground. The crow didn't move as I stepped towards it. It just stared at me, unblinking, as if it knew what was coming and didn't care. My hand shook as I raised the rock. I could feel the weight of the man's eyes on me, pressing down like a lead blanket. I wanted to turn and run, to get away from this horrible situation, but I didn't. Instead, I brought the rock down with a sickening crunch. It almost felt like my hands weren't my own. "Good," the man said, his voice cold and approving. "Very good." I dropped the rock, my hand trembling. I felt sick, like I was going to throw up. But the man didn't seem to care. He was watching me with those dark eyes, like he was measuring me, judging me. "That was your first test," he said, "and you passed." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Is it over now?" "Not quite," he said, his smile returning. "There's more to be done, but you're off to a fine start." I didn't want to know what else he had in mind, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. It was like I was trapped in a nightmare, one I couldn't wake up from. Over the next few days, I found myself returning to the woods, drawn back by the man's promises. Each time I met him, he had another test for me. At first, they were small things: breaking windows, stealing from local shops, vandalizing property. Things that felt wrong, but didn't leave me with blood on my hands like the crow had. But as the days went on, his demands grew darker. One evening, he told me to set fire to an abandoned house on the edge of town. The flames danced high into the sky, the smoke curling in thick black tendrils. I watched from a distance as the fire consumed the old building, the heat stinging my eyes, the smell of burning wood and ash filling my lungs. Still, it wasn't enough. Each task he gave me left me feeling hollow inside, like I was losing pieces of myself. But I couldn't stop. His influence over me grew stronger with every test, his voice echoing in my head, even when I wasn't with him. "You're almost ready," he said one evening, his tone dripping with satisfaction. One last test. I didn't want to know what it was. I didn't want to follow him anymore. But the hold he had on me was too strong. That night, he led me even deeper into the woods than I'd ever dared to go before. The path narrowed until it disappeared completely, leaving us to weave between towering trunks in silence. I had absolutely no idea where I was going. I was screaming internally to run, but it was as if my body had a mind of its own. Finally, we came to a clearing. In the middle of it stood an old, dilapidated well. The stones around its rim were slick with moss, and the wooden cover was half rotted away. It looked ancient, like it had been there for centuries. "This is it," the man said, his voice low and commanding. "What is it?" I asked, tentatively. "Your final test," he said, his black eyes gleaming in the moonlight. "If you want the power I've promised you, you'll need to retrieve something from the well." I stared at the well. "What's down there?" "A treasure," he said, smirking. "Something that will give you the strength to do anything you desire. You'll never have to feel powerless again." I didn't know if I believed him, but something about the way he spoke, the certainty in his voice, made me want to trust him. And yet, I felt sick to my stomach. He handed me a long, thick rope. "You'll need this." I took it, my hand shaking. The well seemed bottomless, its dark mouth yawning open, like the entrance to another world. I hesitated, glancing back at the man. His expression was unreadable, his eyes fixed on me with intensity. I don't think I can," I stammered. "You can," he said, his voice hardening. "And you will." I looked at the well again. I didn't want to do this, but I had to know. The pull of the unknown was too strong. I tied the rope around the stone lip of the well and lowered it into the darkness. The rope slipped through my hands for what felt like forever, before it finally hit something solid far below. "Climb down," the man said, his voice quiet but firm. With a deep breath, I grabbed the rope and started my descent into the well. The air grew colder as I went deeper. My breath echoed around me, each inhale and exhale sounding louder, more frantic. I kept my eyes on the rope, focusing on each knot, each inch of progress. Finally, my feet touched the ground. The bottom of the well was surprisingly dry. The air saturated with the smell of damp earth and something else that I couldn't figure out. I struggled to see in the dim light. There, in the corner of the well, something glinted in the shadows. I hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. As I crouched down, I saw it. A small box, no bigger than a shoebox, made of blackened wood, with strange, intricate carvings covering its surface. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cool surface of the box. A jolt of electricity shot through my hand, making me drop the box in shock. I picked it back up cautiously. It almost felt like it was pulsing in my hands. "This is it," I whispered to myself. But as I lifted the box, something strange happened. The carvings on the surface seemed to shift, the patterns twisting and rearranging themselves. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. And then I heard it. A voice, soft and distant, but growing louder. My name. Panicking, I yanked the box into my arms and scrambled up the rope as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I reached the top, hauling myself over the edge and collapsing onto the cold, hard ground. The man was waiting, his dark eyes gleaming with approval. "You've done well," he said, his voice low. "Now, open it." With a deep breath, I lifted the lid. Inside was a mirror. Small, handheld and old, its once polished surface now clouded with age. I frowned, confused. This was the treasure? This was what I'd risked everything for? I glanced up at the man, who was watching me with an expectant smile. "Look into it," he said softly. "See your true reflection." I didn't want to, but my hands seemed to move of their own accord. Slowly, I lifted the mirror and gazed into it. At first, I saw nothing but my own face, a grimace of fear. But then, as I stared deeper, the image began to shift. My reflection twisted and contorted, the skin pulling tight over my skull, my eyes sinking into hollow sockets. My mouth stretched into a horrible smile, my teeth sharp and jagged. The person in the mirror wasn't me. It was a monster, a demonic creature. I dropped the mirror in shock. What was that?" The man's smile widened. "That, boy, is who you really are. A reflection of your soul." I shook my head, backing away from him. "No, that's not me. That can't be me." He stepped closer, his eyes dark and unblinking. "You've proven yourself, time and time again. Each test, each choice you made, has shaped you into what you see now. You belong to me. I couldn't believe it. I'd been swept away by his charisma and charm. It almost felt like I was watching myself do these things. Everything he'd made me do. The crow, the vandalism, the fire. They weren't just tests. They were steps. Steps towards becoming something else. Something darker. I tried to speak, but my throat was too tight. You tricked me. I didn't trick you, he said, his voice soft and cruel. I merely showed you the path. You chose to walk it. This whole time, I'd thought I was proving myself, becoming stronger, better. But in reality, I'd been unravelling, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the darkness. I stumbled back, shaking my head. No, I won't do this. I won't be like you. The man's expression didn't change. He simply watched me, his smile cold and knowing. You already are. I wanted to scream, to deny it, but deep down, I knew he was right. I had made the choices. I had taken the steps. And now, I had to live with what I'd become. With one final smile, the man began to fade, his form dissolving into the shadows of the woods. His voice lingered in the air long after he was gone. I'll see you again, boy. Sooner than you think. I was alone now, the box still at my feet. The mirror inside it glinted in the moonlight, taunting me with its reflection. I didn't run. I didn't scream. I just stood there, staring at the thing that had once been me. And in that moment, I realised the truth. The man wasn't some stranger. He wasn't just a monster lurking in the woods. He was me. I had met the devil that day, but the real horror was this. He had always been there, waiting for me to see him for who he really was. And now, I was him.